it's Casey, and today we're going to have a chill chat about how I rate books. So today is going to be just like a chill chatting video, as you can maybe tell because of the fact that I'm sitting on the ground next to my other bookshelf. So I wanted to do a video where I talked about how I rate books and the things I consider when I'm rating them. So the way that people rate and review books I feel like is extremely subjective, and I think it's important to kind of define how I'm considering it. When I say something's a 4-star book, what do I usually mean by that? I try to keep it consistent within my own rating system, but honestly I've seen it kind of grow and develop, especially across the course of this last year since I really started getting into it and started getting into rating them. So I'm gonna be honest, a 4-star book that I rated this month may not be the same as a 4-star book that I read back in February, but we'll kind of get into that. So I started really trying to critically evaluate books and rate and review them back in probably like January or February was really when I started getting into it more. So I think I didn't actually technically make my Goodreads account till like last November or something, but I would say any ranking that happened before March is a little bit inflated from what I would probably put it at now. I've decided to become a little bit more critical and nitpicky on my ratings. That being said, my rating average is still pretty high. According to Goodreads, I think my average rating is just over 4.0, and I think that's higher than a lot of other people's, but I think there's a pretty decent explanation for that. I don't think it's that I'm easier on books than other people, although I certainly have been trying to get a little bit more critical of them as I go. But I think part of it is that I was out of reading for a good chunk of time, like several years there I wasn't reading hardly anything. So now I'm going in and I'm playing catch up with a lot of the things that I know I'm really gonna like. So for example, right now I'm not picking anything up if I don't think I'm gonna give it really a 4 or a 5 stars. Like I'm only picking up things that I really think I have a good chance of loving. But I just think that since I'm catching up from years of not reading, there's a little bit more like surefire bets for me to pull from, and that's a lot of what I'm doing right now. So I think over time my average rating is gonna kind of drop once I catch up with a lot of those like backlist titles that I've wanted to read for a long time. Another thing that I think it's important to acknowledge is that I read a fair amount of books before I started using Goodreads, and I didn't go back and rate them because I felt like any ratings I gave retroactively like that wouldn't really be representative of my feelings. So I've only rated things that I have read since I made the Goodreads account. So let's go ahead and get into star ratings and how I think about them. So a 1-star book is a book that I actively disliked. There are a ton of flaws, or I just hated it for some reason and I just actively did not like it. So I want to go ahead and give an example of a book for each of the star ratings. So the only 1-star book that I actually have is Stolen Innocence by Mary Ann Broberg. So this is a book that I read for a book club that I do with my mom and my sister. So my mom wanted to pick a true crime book, and she had just watched a Netflix documentary on this, so she picked this one. I hated this book. It is written by the mother of a girl who was abducted, and there's just so much wild stuff in here. So this book overall, I hated it. I thought it was poorly written, it was a mess, it was such a biased perspective, I didn't like it. So this is an example of a 1-star book. So next we have 2-star books. So 2 stars to me is not a book that I actively disliked, because that would be a 1-star, but it was okay. Like I had a lot of problems with it. I wouldn't say I really enjoyed it. Maybe there were parts that I liked, but parts that I really hated. Overall it averages out to, it was okay. Nothing special, nothing I really actively liked or necessarily would recommend. And an example of a 2-star book that I read this year would be You by Caroline Kepnes. So I know that this is a book that a lot of people really love, but it just did not do it for me. I didn't hate this book, but I had a lot of problems with it. I can't remember exactly what all of them were now, but there were some things that I felt like really weren't believable or just were weird or I didn't like. Like there were just still some aspects that I didn't like, but there were some parts of this that I did enjoy, but overall like so much of it was a negative for me that I couldn't say that like, yeah, I like this book. Like this book was okay. So now we get into 3-star books, and 3-star books are books that I would say I liked them. I didn't love them or anything, but I liked them well enough, and I would generally say if 1-star books are don't read at all, 2-star books are I wouldn't really recommend, 3-star books probably fall into that category of I would recommend it if you're interested in the topic. It's not a universal recommendation, it's not everyone should read this, but if you're interested, I think you might really like it. But for me, wasn't anything special, but I didn't dislike it, but I liked it overall. So an example of a 3-star book for me would be The Diviners by Libba Bray. So this was a book I picked up actually expecting to love it, but I just liked it. You know, I didn't love it. And the difference between like it and love it is so subjective, unless you're Cold Stone, I guess. So it's hard to define the difference between a 3 and a 4 star. This is 3, 4, and 5 is where it starts to get a little nebulous. But I would say a 3-star book is a book that, like, I had some problems with, but there was more positives than negatives, so that pulls it out of a 2-star category. Or if I felt like, I liked this, I don't have any major complaints, but it just really didn't do it for me, that can also land a book in a 3-star category. For example, I felt like with The Diviners, I liked the setting, I liked the premise, those were all big pluses for me, but I really didn't connect with some of the characters, I got frustrated at some of what was happening, and overall it just didn't have that, like, factor, that elusive factor that made me love it. So, like, this was good. I liked it, and I recognize why a lot of people love it, but it just didn't do it for me. So that kind of lands it in that 3-star category in my mind. So next we have 4-star books. So 4 stars are probably the rating I give out the most. So a 4-star book to me is a book that I'm like, yeah, that was really, really good, I loved that. I know that sounds like so subjective, but a 4-star book for me tends to be books where I liked the overwhelming majority of it. I have a lot of positive things to say about it, but there was like maybe a couple of negatives for me, or some things that detracted from my enjoyment, or some pieces that I didn't like. So an example of a 4-star book for me that I haven't talked about before would be The 100,000 Kingdoms by N.K. Jemisin. I loved this book. Like, this was a really great series and I really enjoyed it, but there were some aspects that like weren't quite there for me. For example, there were some characters that I absolutely loved in this and some that I didn't like as much or I didn't think were as well rounded out. But overall, like, the characters, the atmosphere, the pacing were all things that I thought were really, really solid. So overall this came out to a 4-star book. Next we have 5-star books. So 5-star books are books that make me just go, it was amazing. It goes a little bit beyond just like, oh, I loved that, I thought that was really, really good, and it goes into, oh my god, this is amazing, everyone should read it. So a 5-star book for me is a book that had almost no flaws, so, or at least none that bothered me, or some that I'm willing to overlook because of just the amazing, excited, wonderful feeling that the book gave me. Also, I feel like a 5-star book is a book that I would recommend to mostly anyone. This isn't always true. For example, I gave The Poppy War 5 stars, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend that to everyone because of some of the content in it. But generally speaking, I would say a 5-star book is everyone should read this book, or everyone who's interested in this kind of book should read this book. So an example of a 5-star book for me would be A Darker Shade of Magic by V.E. Schwab. So this is a book that I thought was amazing. I really loved it. I burned through all 3 of these so fast. Do I recognize that there are some flaws in this book? Yeah, and I could see why some people might not like it, but for me, this hit a lot of the right points. This really did it for me, that I thought this was an amazing read. So it's not a requirement of a 5-star book for me to get like really excited about what I'm reading, but I think it definitely helps tip the scale from a 4 to a 5 for me. And this was one where I just wanted to talk about it and I wanted to recommend it to people afterwards, and that is usually a mark that a book is 5 stars for me. So then there's really one more tier of rankings for me, and it's when I feel like I should put a book on my favorites list. If it goes on like my favorites of all time list, which doesn't honestly have that many books on it right now, it is a book that when I finish it, I think to myself, oh my god, I wish I could give this 6 stars. And you all know what book I'm about to pull out. And that is The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet by Becky Chambers. I haven't said those words in like 2 months. So The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet is probably one of my favorite books of all time and forever. So this is a book that when I finished it, I thought was just amazing. I loved it. I want everyone to read this book, and I wish I could give it 6 stars. Like, I cannot praise this book enough. 5 stars doesn't quite cover how I feel about it, and that's how I know it should go on my favorites list. So that's kind of what puts a book in each category for me, but I wanted to talk to you guys briefly about what kinds of things I consider when I am ranking and reviewing books. So for me, there are a couple of aspects that I consider when I'm thinking about my opinions on a book. So that tends to be writing, characters, and plot. And for me personally, I am a very character-driven reader. Usually, a book has to have very good characters for me to like it, and the strength of a book's characters will really affect my ranking of a book. Whereas the plot, if there are some plot holes but great characters, I'm not gonna notice as much, so I think that's something to keep in mind when looking at how I rate books, is that characters really drive my ratings. Really, plot is kind of what I tend to care about the least. Writing style for me, I'm still trying to figure out the way to describe writing styles that I like. I feel like that's the one I struggle to put into words the most. Sometimes I like straightforward writing styles, sometimes I like lyrical writing styles. It can really be kind of muddy, and I don't fully have my preferences for that nailed down yet. But I would say that the writing style also contributes to creating an atmosphere, and atmosphere is really important for me, as well as pacing, and I would say that pacing is a part of writing style and kind of a part of plot. A book's pacing is important to me. If it drags on, unless we're doing some S-tier character development that will make me forget that we haven't done anything in 100 pages, sometimes the pacing of a book can really pull it down for me. Plot for me is like almost a secondary element to a lot of the other things. A book has to have an interesting plot for me to want to pick it up in the first place. Like, I feel like plot is that initial draw, and I want it to be well executed and I want it to make sense, but I feel like I don't spend a lot of time like analyzing a plot and looking for plot holes. But beyond that, plot doesn't really do that much for me. So if you are a plot-driven reader, I would say beware a little bit of some of my recommendations, especially if I'm recommending books based almost exclusively on their characters, because I probably haven't considered the plot that much, or it just didn't matter that much to me. And the last thing I think about, and I don't think about this with every book, is theme. And it's something I've been trying to think about more when I read to try to read more critically. But for some books, I have to base my ranking on, does it do what it set out to do? And some books, this is more important than others, but in books where it really stands out to me, that usually also will inflate a rating for me. I hope that gives you guys some insight into the way I rate books so that you can better take my recommendations and understand where I'm coming from with a lot of it. But I think that's all I've got for you guys today. If you want to keep up with what I'm reading and rating, I've got a link to my Goodreads in the description below. But other than that, I'll see you guys next time.